Welcome everyone, and welcome especially to our guest speaker and author, Allison Tyra. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read her book, Uncredited, Women's Overlooked, Misattributed, and Stolen Work, it's quite a read, and it makes me very passionate about the fact that women are not given the credit they deserve and haven't for centuries. And I think I hope that you all will either read it or I mean buy it and read it or get it from the library. We're trying to get it into the Sonoma County Library as well. Um, Let me read you Allison's bio really quickly so that you know more. She is the creator and manager of Infinite Women, an ever-expanding encyclopedia of women. After reading the stories of tens of thousands of women and wondering why she'd never heard of many of them, she began compiling notes for what would become her debut book, Uncredited. Although most of Allison's creative projects have been performance-based, Uncredited is a return to her journalistic roots. An American expat, Allison lives in regional Australia with her husband and what he says are far too many cats and she feels are not enough. So go ahead, Allison. It's all yours.
I would like to state that bio is slightly outdated. I now agree that we have too many cats, but that's neither here nor there. So, the fundamental question that I wanted to answer with this book was one that I would guess most of us have heard either explicitly or implicitly. If women are as good as men, why haven't I heard of more women, right? There's that immediate assumption that, of course, we aren't. That's why it starts with if. It's that automatic, I don't believe this, but you can try to convince me, right? So here's why, right? And as Amy mentioned, this book came out of my Infinite Women project. Currently, the database has over 7,000 biographies, and my list of to do is around 225,000, and that's also constantly expanding. So sometimes I'll complain to my husband that this work feels never ending, and he's like, "You literally called it infinite. You did this to yourself." Which, to be fair, I say the same thing to him when he does stupid things like a 50K trail run. So we, we are a very empathetic family, is what I'm saying. So, all that to say is, as far as I know, mine is the only database that isn't focused geographically. It's not focused on a particular kind of woman, whether that's personal traits or women in a certain field. It's not limited to a particular time period. And so the fact that I was seeing these patterns playing out, despite that huge range of women, is what led to this book, right? I saw these patterns and I started making notes. And when you have 600 notes, you should probably go ahead and write a book. So, what I found is that question, we know women are as good as men, so why haven't I heard of more women, is what's often referred to as a wicked problem, right? It's not easy to solve. It's very complicated in both the causes and the effects and the potential fixes. Fundamentally, I broke it down into five main categories. So, respectability, what do we consider appropriate for women? What do we expect of women? Being undermined in any number of ways. Credit being outright stolen, of course, is a major chapter. But there's also contributions being ignored. So things like a lot of women collaborated with their husbands, but then were treated as though she's just his assistant. And a big one of those is being overlooked for awards in various fields. But the biggest one that I found, the one that I would argue is the dominant factor, is documentation. So we're talking about what gets recorded, what gets saved, and what gets told. So picture a multi-tiered sieve for each of these, where at every level you are losing women's stories through all those tiny little holes. So what actually makes it to public awareness is only this very thin trickle. And all of these stages are also impacted by privilege. And so I'm going to use the diary of Anne Lister as an example. So, Anne Lister, for anyone who's not aware, was an 1800s British lesbian who wore men's clothing. She wrote about how she was seducing all the ladies, and she even had a wedding with another woman on her property. Um, so we know this because she wrote it all down. Now, the fact that she recorded this in these extensive diaries, even though they were in code, even though they were hidden in the walls of the family home, the fact that she felt secure enough to document this in the first place really reflects the fact that she was wealthy, she was well connected, she did have power to the point that she felt safe writing all this down. So, right off the bat, we see how her privilege impacted just the creation of this in the first place. In other ways, it's largely comes down to who considers themselves worth writing about and who do other people consider worth writing about. So, maybe that's news coverage, maybe that's letters. Um, but it really comes down to who and what do we value, but also who can keep a diary in the first place, who's literate, who can afford the materials, who has the time and energy, and again, considers themselves interesting enough to write that all down. So, Anne Lister died in the mid 1800s, and around 1890, a distant relative, I'm going to call him a great nephew. That's not the exact relationship, but it's the simple version. He and his buddy find the diaries hidden in a wall in the family home. And they're able to decode it. I believe there was a key with it. I don't think they were, master code crackers. And they read all of this scandalous material. And the buddy tells the great nephew, "You've got to destroy this. This could wreck your family's reputation. We need to burn these." And fortunately, the great nephew didn't, right? This may be the most important thing that this person ever did in his whole life, was simply choosing to not destroy these diaries and just put them back in the wall where they found them. I believe there is also a theory that he was queer as well. I don't really know his story because I don't really care about men's history. So, flash forward to 1934. The great nephew has died the year before. I would guess other people have moved into the home because the diary is rediscovered. And the buddy from 1890, he's still kicking around and he's like, "Oh, yeah, I know how to read those." And he's the one who then shared, "Well, this is what happened in 1890. So he's why we know that." And so many of these examples where things either were or were not preserved, we just have no way of knowing, right? That's just lost. If you didn't document it, then how are later generations supposed to know? So in 1934, that's when the diaries are actually officially put into an archival collection. The queerness is not publicized at this point, even by academics. I think there was some writing on the diaries as a whole and what can these tell us about that time, but nobody was really talking about how she was a huge lesbian running around in men's clothes. And so both of these stages we see the importance of things being saved, right? In the first instance by the family, but then later being put into an actual archive, into an institution where, at the very least, they are much less likely to be destroyed or just fall victim to the elements. So, mildew is a huge issue, right? If things are stored in a place that is not environmentally sound, shall we say, the damp will destroy so many things. So, okay, step one, check. Step two, check. But the public still doesn't know about this. So when I say what gets told, we're looking at who gets books written about them, who is featured in exhibitions, whose materials get digitized? That's a huge one for access. What gets included in school curricula and textbooks? And so 1988, the year I was born, right? This is how long this process has been taking for the Diaries of Anne Lister. We are well over 100 years past her death. And it is only in 1988 that the first academic, so still not even mainstream, but the first academic publishes about this was super queer, you guys. And it's then not for another 30 years, basically, until we get the book in 2017 and the series in 2019, Gentleman Jack. So that's how most people who know about Ann Lister know about her, is because a popular book and television show were made about her. But you can see this very long process that it took to get her story out there. And once again, coming back to the privilege of it all and biases that we have. So, like I mentioned, written records are very much reflective of privilege. So, for example, on the Infinite Women podcast, one of the episodes I have is about who tells the stories of enslaved women. And, it's basically never the enslaved women themselves. Very occasionally it is, but even then it is often through the intermediary of a white abolitionist who is actually the one writing everything down. So the fact that we are so fixated on written over oral histories reinforces a lot of these existing biases that we already have, that already mean that we're less likely to have these stories in the first place. And one example that I have is Sybil Luddington. So she was basically Paul Revere, but better, right? So she rode way further than he did. I think she rode 42 miles to warn her father and his troops that the British were coming to burn Danbury, Connecticut. She also didn't get caught, which Paul Revere got caught. All right, if we're choosing who gets a poem written about them, Sybil is objectively better. But the Daughters of the American Revolution, so their local chapter, they love her, right? There's a statue of her that I actually find terrifying. The face looks really weird. You can Google it if you want. But they will, sell books about her in their gift shop, right? The local DAR chapter respects her story and celebrates it. The national DAR refused to grant her their, I believe it's called Heroine of the Revolution. So this is essentially a designation that they give to women who they consider worthy. And the reason that was given is, oh, well, we don't have any proof of that. That's just a story that got passed down in the family. And the thing I find really funny about that, apart from just the general devaluing of oral histories, is that written documentation is full of biases, right? This idea that written documentation is something that we can just trust without questioning it is not true. And a lot of, like, say, the Viking sagas or the Homeric epics, these are things that were passed down in oral tradition for a century or more before they were ever written down. And so the fact that somebody wrote it down at some point doesn't mean it doesn't come out of oral history. So that's my oral history rant. And then I did want to just touch on intersectionality, because one of the things I did try to do in the book is look at how other marginalizations and other identities intersect with gender. So, as mentioned with Ann Lister, most queer people in history didn't have her privileges. And so one of the reasons that we do not have as much documentation of queer history as we otherwise might is because a lot of queer people would have been in serious danger. Depending on the time and place, it just would not have been safe for you to tell your story or to allow other people's to tell it. So, disability was actually a really interesting one, because there are several women with known disabilities in the book, and I found it interesting to look at how people like Gertrude Ederle, who's a swimmer, Annie Jump Cannon, and Henrietta Swan Leavitt were Harvard College Observatory astronomers, and they all had significant hearing loss. But as far as I could tell, right, I didn't write full biographies of anyone, but looking at their story, their hearing loss does not seem to have held them back from doing the things that they wanted to do and that they became known for. By contrast, Louise Bertin was a French composer. She's the only composer to have collaborated with Victor Hugo to adapt one of his works to an opera. And they made La Esmeralda, a version of Hunchback of Notre Dame. But Louise Bertin had a mobility issue. I don't know the exact nature of what was going on. Again, a lot of documentation doesn't necessarily address what was happening with someone who may have had a disability, um, unless there's like a clear reason for it, right? Maybe they didn't know, maybe they didn't want to talk about it. But regardless, she had difficulty standing for long periods and she had difficulty walking. And the theater where this production was being put on was not accessible. Shock. So, because of this, a male composer, Hector Berlioz, was hired to oversee rehearsals for the whole production. And this led to rumors that, I bet Berlioz is actually the one who wrote, like, if not the whole show, then like the better songs. And she ended up never writing another opera. There were other things going on with that production. It was a whole cluster. Read the book. But it was an overall like extremely bad experience for her. But I have to assume that the Berlioz rumors, which he denied, right? He never tried to claim credit. He actively denied that that was the case. So it's not his fault at all. But I have to assume that that contributed to her saying, you know what, to hell with it. I'm never writing another opera. And what I find really infuriating about the misattribution, right? Whether it's a guy claiming credit for himself, but also often other people will sort of the inverse of scapegoating. They will credit a man for a woman's work, which is something that I get into in the book in more depth. But what I find really insane about that is all these people who try to claim that women aren't as good as men, right? Like, oh, a woman couldn't have done that, right? Hector Berlioz is even today, a very well-known classical composer. If you know classical music, you probably know Berlioz's name and his music. The people saying, I bet he actually wrote that music, are saying her work is as good as his. If it can be mistaken for his, it was as good as his. If it was worth a man stealing it, it is as good or better than his. So just something to sort of keep in mind. I was telling Amy before we got started that one way to look at this, because it is very enraging to read this book. Someone said that, oh, you could, have it on your nightstand. I was like, no, do not read this before bed. It will not help you sleep. But I do actually find it really empowering to look at the breadth and depth of what men have had to do to keep women down, right? There is no better argument against if women are as good as men than the lengths that they have to go to, all the things that they have to do. Because if we actually were inferior, they wouldn't have to do any of this. I wouldn't have had a book to write if we actually were unable to keep up with them, if we actually had less potential in them. I wouldn't have had a book. So another intersectional element is race, and Sojourner Truth, interestingly, also had a disability in one of her hands, which, again, like Gertrude Ederle and Annie Jump Cannon and Henrietta Swan Leavitt, I didn't really see that that impacted her work as an activist, as a speaker. She's mentioned here because the reason she's in my book is if you've heard of the Ain't I a Woman speech, that just the name makes me so mad. because it is highly unlikely she ever said that. So, Sojourner Truth was born into slavery in New York. Her first language was Dutch. And we have a version of this speech that was published a few days after she delivered it. And my understanding is that she knew the editor. And so that version is almost certainly the official approved version of the speech. 12 years later, a white woman, Frances Dana Barker Gage, publishes her version of this, and that's the Ain't I a Woman speech. You can look at them side by side. I highly recommend it. But you can see the white lady slaps this Southern slave patois on it that, she's putting words in there that Sojourner Truth never said this. And yet, that's the version that caught the public imagination, I guess. And so even now, it is known as that. And like the Wikipedia page is called Ain't I a Woman Speech. And it's just exhausting. There are many, many other examples of race intersecting with gender in the book, but that was just one that I wanted to mention. And there's also anyone who is not cisgender. So, especially athletes is really where I get into this. And anyone who's not familiar, Caster Semenya is an intersex runner, and Leah Thomas is a transgender swimmer. And they have both been lightning rods for arguing that um, any woman who does not fit within a narrow criteria of what people consider to be a woman, that that person shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's sports. And it's pretty much always people who don't seem to give a crap about women's sports in any other context. And so you can very much see how this is just rooted in misogyny. It's just people trying to enforce their idea of what women are and are not on other people. And also, I get into how the arguments around biological differences just don't hold up. Because if we were going to not allow people to compete because they had some biological advantage, Michael Phelps, for one, would never be allowed anywhere near a pool. Which, again, you can look it up. You can read about that in the book. I'm not going to get too far into it here. But I really wanted to just address why those reasons don't hold water. Because when it comes down to it, sexism is not logical. Sexism is not based in fact. And that's really what I wanted to very clearly lay out with this entire book is that whole if women are as good as men nonsense is just that. It's nonsense. And I hope anybody who reads this has their paradigm shifted because a lot of times we're not even conscious of it. But I do hope that having it all laid out like this will help change minds, even if it's just coming face to face with our own entrenched biases that we may not even be aware of. Yeah. And now, if anybody has questions, I would love to listen to other people talk for a minute.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I'm Elaine Rock, and I have a biography out about Barbara Dusty Rhodes, uh, who meet the hidden figure who really ignited the women's movement. And I am in awe of the work that you have done on this book. And I just wanted to give you a kudos for that. And I wanted to find out how much time did you spend researching this?
Well, so the interesting thing is, unlike a biography like you've written,
Right.
um, I honestly don't know how anybody could set out to write this book, by which I mean I was doing what I call passive research, right? As I was going through my normal Infinite Women work, I would be like, "Oh, there's another one." And so I'd make a note, make a note. And one of the reasons I was so passionate about getting this book out in particular, like there's other projects that I've worked on that, I'm like, yeah, no, this is important, but uncredited, I honestly don't know that anyone else could have researched it because most people who are working in women's history are focused on a particular person, they're focused on a particular type of woman. So like I know queenship scholars who specifically research queens, and they are fascinating people to talk to. But because there are very few people who are spending as much time as I am looking at women's history through a generalist lens, I get asked the research question a lot. I'm like, I don't know how you would research this.
Well, I mean, I was wondering whether you started out thinking that was exactly the direction you were going into, or did you have a different idea to do something different, another book?
No, I just started making notes about women's work
Yeah.
in general, and that, of course, is just way too broad. Um, and so you might break that down into different categories. Like, I've got one work in progress about the refusal to invest in women. So whether that's women's education, women's sports, women's businesses, right? Women are still incredibly underrepresented in terms of who gets venture capital. And breaking that down on the monetary side. And so I was just looking at my insane spreadsheet with various notes, and I just pulled women who were able to accomplish things, right? Because I was making notes on a lot of things that prevented women from accomplishing those things, right? And I said, okay, but what about the women who were able to get something done and then they didn't get credit for it?
Right. There were plenty of them.
Well, there's over 600 stories in the book, and more than that number of women, because a lot of the stories are multiple women. And so I believe there are thousands of women in the book. But even then, I I had to stop writing about 6 months before it came out, because I kept being like, oh wait, I've got another one. Because this is also infinite. And I have, I think, something like 16 pages of additional stories that didn't make it into the first one.
You've got a part two.
Expanded edition.
Right. Right.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Allison, for your presentation. Does anyone else have any questions at this time? I've got some, but anybody who wants to go first? Um, Rebecca, I
Yeah,
see you, and then
okay. I was just wondering what the geographical scope was of your book. It doesn't sound like it's taking in like Asia or Eastern Europe or Africa or places like that, right?
there is a definite bias towards European and US and Australia, New Zealand, essentially countries that are predominantly white and predominantly English speaking. Part of that is the resources that are available because obviously countries where English is not the dominant language, there are significantly fewer English language histories available. And also, like I mentioned with the intersectionality, narratives that are not reflective of dominant um, privilege in a given country are less likely to be recorded in the first place. They're less likely to be saved. Um, and I do try to include as many different countries as I can. So, for example, you mentioned Africa.
We'll
Um,
see how much brother's gonna eat. You're gonna finish one? If you finish
Tiffany,
one,
could you
you
mute yourself?
sorry.
Um, so you mentioned Africa. One of the examples in the book is the Benin bronzes, which told a lot of stories about, queens. And because the Ben and Bronzes were not just decorative, they were telling the story of their people. And that history was lost because of British colonialist looters stealing and destroying the Ben and Bronzes. And even today, I believe many, many more of them are held outside of the country than inside. But even if they were all brought back together, we have no way of knowing the order that they were in. The British did not document the original state of the bronzes. They just took photos of them piled up and labeled them loot. So there are definitely stories like that. But I will be the first to admit that there is a white Western English speaking bias.
Elaine, what you got?
I thought it was pretty interesting what you were talking about, and I'm wondering two questions. One, what was your motivation for writing it? I mean, what kind of brought you to that place where you said, "Oh my goodness, this is something I need to look at, I need to share with the world." And the second thing is, what was the greatest impact that you had? I mean, what is it that you're sitting there reading? Like I know, like we're celebrating the centennial when they had the first women's group meeting to the first suffrage group. And I couldn't believe that most of these women were housewives. That was so interesting to me, and it was an impact. So something like that. What was the big aha that all of a sudden you're sitting there and you say, "Oh my God, I didn't know this."
Um, because there's so many stories, I don't know that there was a single one that really stood out to me. I think it was more the ways that these keep happening today. So a lot of the stories in the book are from the last 10 years. So um, one of the examples I like to point out is keeping women out of medical school wasn't just something that the Edinburgh Seven were fighting against in 1800s. It's also something that as recently as 2018, I believe it was 10 major medical schools in Japan were exposed for deliberately sabotaging women trying to get in. They
Really?
were deliberately downgrading their entrance exams, and their reasoning was first that the classic women are just going to have babies and leave the profession, so why would we bother taking the time to train them? And that's particularly funny because if you know anything about Japan, they are absolutely freaking out. Like, not everybody, obviously, but a lot of the dudes in the government are losing their minds over their low birth rate. Which also comes up in the book because they fired their minister for, I don't know the exact title, but essentially the minister to try to promote people having babies. They replaced a woman who was a mother with a man who was not a parent. And the best he could do was he put on a pregnancy belly as like a publicity stunt. That was the best he could do to understand the concerns that parents, particularly women, might have. So those through lines where you see not just things that people can write off as, oh, but that's a thing of the past. No, it's not. It's not. And as we saw with the Ann Lister example, so many of these stories do not come to light until long after not just the thing happened, but long after the person died. And so there are definitely things happening right now that we will not know about for years or decades or longer. And then, I'm sorry, what was your first question? I got distracted by the second one.
What was your motivation? What brought you to the place that you did you read something? Did you meet somebody or?
Well, like I said, I was making notes on just generally like women's work, and then something about even if a woman is able to accomplish something, because there's all these barriers just preventing them from even doing the work in the first place. For them to not even get credit when they have overcome all of this other stuff just to do the amazing thing is deeply enraging, but it's also what perpetuates, because we know that visibility matters, representation matters. So the fact that these stories are hidden and the mechanisms by which they are hidden, because again, it's not just one thing. It's so many different things happening over and over and over again. It's both the variety and the degree to which these things are done. Um, that is further used to tell women that we can't do things, right? There haven't been like any women scientists. I mean, there was like Marie Curie, I guess, but really she was just her husband's assistant. You know, that. But if you read my book, you'll see, well, here's, I mean, literally over 100 women scientists across all different fields, and here's how they got screwed over. Here's why you haven't heard of them. So the I think everyone should be enraged at the histories that have been kept from us. Not just women's history, but queer history and BIPOC history, and disabled history. These are all stories that we do not get taught, as the default. And that should piss you off. I know
It,
Amy said it pissed her off.
it does. It pisses us off.
Well, it's my favorite review so far is my mom, who is a lovely 68-year-old, nice white Midwestern lady. And she said, this really pissed me off. And I don't know that I've ever heard her say that anything pissed her off before. So that is my favorite. But like I said, I do also like, on the positive side, I do find it very empowering to say, look at everything they have to do to keep us down, right? Look at how hard they have to work at it. So that's if you want a less blood pressure raising way to look at it. Did anyone else have any questions?
Eileen does, and then Camarina. Eileen, let's.
I am.
Okay.
Actually,
got it.
it's more of a comment. I went to college, liberal arts school in the 60s, and many colleges about the same time had the same book. It was Jansen's History of Art. And it was pointed out to me just recently that there are no women artists in that huge book. And I couldn't believe it. I still have the book. I went through it. There's no woman artist. It's just amazing.
Yep, and that is referenced in my book. And there's also a project, I think Katie Hess is the name of the woman who does it. But yeah, it's essentially a history of art without women. And so she's got her own book. I think she does like museum tour type things. But also if you are interested in women artists, part of why I started building the Infinite Women database is because I want people to be able to find these stories. And so because of that, I have tags. So there's tags for personal traits, like if you are queer, if you are a person of African descent, if you're an indigenous person, if you're a disabled person, all of those tags exist on my website, and you can also search by field or area of impact. So if you did want visual artists, come on over. I've got thousands.
Camarina?
Hi, my name is Camarina Davidson, and my question, because this is really very interesting that it's something that like we've all noticed but haven't really looked at it. It's like a broad issue, and like that it's that we should do something about it. So, what do you want people to take away from like reading your book and like getting to know more about this topic.
Sure. So earlier I mentioned that paradigm shift of we all have unconscious biases. Like, even if you are a feminist who knows that that's not true, there's still part of your brain that has been hardwired to think that way, because we live in a patriarchal society. So I hope that having it laid out so clearly will help dispel any of that, either conscious or unconscious biases that people have. But I also want people to question what they've been told. So the histories that we are fed are often incomplete or inaccurate. I'm currently working with a campaign. If anybody wants to Google WAPUSH, it's WAPUSH. So if you're familiar with advanced placement in high school, there's AP US History, and this campaign is to get a women's AP US History course approved. And so all we need at this point are more letters from high school. So whether that's a, superintendent or a principal, um, we need a few hundred. But the San Francisco high school teachers who are leading the campaign, they are working on it, and I am helping. So we are hoping that, like, this school year, we will get those last letters that we need and be able to get the ball rolling on the pilot program. So there's initiatives like that that you can either start or get involved in. But just in terms of critical thinking, I feel like we are very much taught by our institutions, whether that's a lot of schools, not all schools. Some schools do teach you to think critically and question things, but a lot of schools do not want you questioning the teacher, right? I remember in, let's see, it would have been freshman year of high school, we had a teacher who very much just taught straight out of the textbook. It was world history, and by world history we mean European history. But I was also a little nerd, and one of my obsessions at the time was Henry VIII and Elizabeth and Mary, and like just the whole Tudor situation. And this guy says, presumably quoting the textbook, that the English monarchy is also the only successful theocracy in world history. Or wait, no, sorry. No, sorry, it was the Byzantine Empire, excuse me. The Byzantine Empire was the only successful theocracy in world history. And I raise my hand and I say, well, what about Henry VIII? He created the Church of England, he's the head of state, and he's the head of the church. Isn't that a theocracy? And the guy just got like a deer in the headlights look. He didn't actually have any real engagement in the material that he was teaching, and he didn't have a response for that. And so he just said, we're not going to talk about that today. And the next period, my best friend had him, and he says the same thing, and she's the same kind of nerd that I am, and she raises her hand and says, well, what about Henry VIII? And he loses it. He says, we are not talking about that today. And so she's telling me this story later, and she's like, I have no idea like what his problem was. Like, I do. But point being, there are a lot of teachers like that who are not encouraging you to have these conversations, not just about what they are telling you, because a lot of authority figures do not like to be questioned, even when they arguably should be questioned. And I think we see that play out way too much in education, at all levels. So I do want people to, like, having read this, question what you've been told. You know? Not in a like, I don't think vaccines should be used kind of way. Like when I say, do your own research, that's not what I mean, but in a way that means that you are really thinking about what you've been told.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And I will finish with talking about Allison, your very well spoken about women, what women can contribute, right, and what women have contributed. But what about men and their allyship? I
So,
noticed that you have a dedication to for Gerard. He knows what he did. Could you talk about that?
yes. So, that is an inside joke with my husband, Jared, because a lot of the women in the book, the men who were either stealing credit for their work or who were given credit, that inverse scapegoat, for their work, a lot of women, that man was their husband. But what Jared did was love me and support me and listen to me rant about things and work through things and feed me. He's a good cook. Oh man, that man cooks. Um, but I really love male allyship stories. And so all those things that I mentioned about what I want people to get out of this, whether it's their own internal biases or questioning what they've been told, or, actual campaigns that they can either start themselves or get involved in. Men can do that too, right? You don't have to be a woman to fight for women's equality. Just like you don't have to be queer to fight for queer rights or disabled to fight for disabled rights. Any ally can do something, right? Whatever your capacity in terms of finances, time, energy, skills, we can all do something. And it's just finding what works for you, whether that's joining someone else's work or starting your own. And I mentioned Marie Curie earlier. She's actually one of my favorite examples in the book because people might say, like, wait, 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 wait. The only woman scientist that most Westerners can probably name. Why is she in your book? Like, she is well known. She's the first woman to win a Nobel, but she almost wasn't. Because originally they did not want to include Marie Curie. They were going to give the award to her husband Pierre and some other dude that we don't care about because I don't care about men's history. So, a prominent male scientist, Gustav Mittagleffler, I probably got some of that name wrong. He was a badass. We love him because he hears about this. And because he's been on Nobel committees and stuff before, so he gets the goss, right? He hears about this. He goes to Pierre and he's like, bro, I assume, bro, they're gonna leave Marie out. We can't let this happen. So Pierre and a third prominent male scientist, they go to the committee and they fight for her. They say, you can't leave her out. She deserves to be recognized as well. And so, if not one, not two, but three men, all prominent scientists, had not gone to bat for her, we probably wouldn't know who Marie Curie was. Because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people wanted to dismiss her as his assistant, both at the time and even since then, even with a Nobel. Um, People still want to dismiss her contributions. Um, and so yeah, I love a male ally. I told Jared that I want to write a book about the good men, and he said, "So a pamphlet." But and I will freely admit that most of the book, like over 90% of the men in the book are the bad guys, right? They are very clearly the majority because people who abuse power are people who have power in the first place, whatever that means. And historically, that has more often been men. I do have a section about women holding women down as well, because I did want to acknowledge that. I don't want any false binaries where, women are all the good guys and men are all the bad guys, because humans are so much more nuanced than that. Um, and I didn't want to flatten anyone's stories. But many of these stories do have, whether it's a colleague, a supportive partner. I love the um, steamboat ladies. So back around the turn of the century, the uh, Cambridge and Oxford would not give degrees to women. They would let you spend your money and put all the work in, but they would not give you that piece of paper. And at the time, Cambridge, Oxford, and Trinity College in Dublin had reciprocity. And so the president of Trinity College, a man, of course, said, "Hey, crazy idea. Why don't we boost tourism?" That wasn't actually his goal, as far as I know. I just like thinking that that was why. What if we boost tourism by inviting all these women who have earned degrees to come here, show us their transcripts, and we'll give them their degrees? And 720 women took him up on it. They hopped on the steamboat to Dublin. We're like, "Please, sir, can I have a degree?" And he's like, "Sure." Um, this is why I probably shouldn't be allowed to tell history, but it's not accurate. But the fact that, this one guy made a decision that meant that 720 women were able to get the degrees that they were denied, I think deserves to be celebrated.
Absolutely. All right, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
All right, Elaine, go ahead. You're the last question. Oh, yeah, there you go.
I do a radio show, Women's Spaces.
Mhm.
And what I just did was for the last, we started a new section called Men's Spaces.
Mhm.
And once a month, we're going to be interviewing our male counterpart because I felt that there's so much division in the world, and that if men come over to a women's show, they can they can learn a little bit. But I really agree with you, because there's no good guy. There's good guys and bad guys. There's, when you look at some of the women today, some of the stands they're taking, I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, they're against abortion, they're against women's rights, they're against medical. I mean, if you saw with Trump, they had all these women surrounding him, and there are many women who will try to shut you up. Let me tell you. So the most important thing is that women have to just recognize who they are and recognize their own power. And I think the most important thing is this whose shoulders we're standing on. And I think that's the really good part about your book, is that you're bringing back all this history, what women have accomplished and what they during times when they really had no power. So I thank you for that.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because what I think you've touched on is power, is privilege and biases, because a lot of those women who act against women's health, women's rights, women's opportunities, people like Phyllis Schlafly, notoriously was the anti-ERA crusader, and she was effective. Like, we can hate her, but she was effective. Um,
Who was that?
oh, Phyllis Schlafly. Oh, okay. Look her up after oh, there's so much there. Phyllis Schlafly crusaded against the Equal Rights Amendment. And if you go watch the miniseries Mrs. America, Kate Blanchett does an amazing job playing her. But what's really interesting is if you look at Phyllis Schlafly's work, she was basically arguing that all these women, she was basically trying to say that women's lib was forcing women out of the kitchen. It was forcing women out of domestic spaces. Rather than saying, well, no, we just want people to be able to choose whether or not that's the right life for them. But in the process of this, she also, like, she went and got a law degree. She's traveling all over the country. Like, she's not a housewife. She's fighting for women to be housewives, but she is not a housewife.
She was
And
amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
And but what's interesting is that she was never able to actually get a position. I was talking recently with someone about this for my podcast. If anybody wants to go read Jill Hasday's book, it's called We the Men: How Forgetting Women's Struggles for Equality Perpetuates Inequality. But we were talking about how Phyllis Schlafly openly like lobbied for a position in I think it was Reagan, but in a Republican administration, and she never got it, right? She was definitely more qualified than a lot of the men because she made herself an expert on things like international relations. She was incredible. She was also just, anti-women's rights. But that was a path for her to attain power, not the kind of power that she wanted, but more power than she otherwise would have. So I do find women like her really interesting. I don't want to spend time with them, but yeah, one of the things that Jill and I got into is how if you are a marginalized person fighting on behalf of an institution or an establishment that doesn't see you as human, that doesn't see you as equal, they're never going to actually give you what you want. You might make money out of it, you might get a high profile and attention out of it, but they will never treat you as an equal, no matter what you do.
Did you say that you saw Mrs. America?
Yeah, the miniseries.
I was trying to, I always encourage people because I personally think even though she was on the wrong side, as far as I'm concerned, the woman was a genius. She stopped
Yeah,
the ERA. I mean, she stopped it and she had women following her. I mean, it
yeah,
was,
like evil genius, but still, like respect your respect your opponents because underestimating them will not turn out well for you.
And Elaine, you do have this wonderful radio show called Women's Spaces, and you have a lot of famous people on. Um, and it is a weekly broadcast. Allison, I don't know if you can hear it from Australia, if you can get it
oh, no,
streaming,
she can hear it.
right?
www.kbbf.org or go on the website.
Oh, that's right, kbbf.org. We'll stream it
Sorry,
on.
just the way you phrase it, like, can you hear it from Australia? But in Australia, yes.
I was thinking, yes, on Mondays, although that would be Tuesdays for you, at 11 o'clock in the morning on Mondays here.
Well, 11 o'clock in the morning your time would be, I believe, middle of the night my time. But if it's
Yeah, but
streaming,
you
then
can
you
hear
can
it.
listen.
You can listen to it online and you can also listen to it when it's on the internet. It streams. But I thought that was an interesting point about, bringing you have to bring men in.
Yeah, and
Unfortunately that it's still, when I look at Trump and I look at some of this stuff that goes on, I think to myself, God, is this real? No, it does feels like it hasn't changed much.
well, an interesting point that I've seen, apart from just, all the ways that men think they benefit from patriarchy, the male loneliness epidemic and how that's tied to women no longer being forced to provide all of the uncompensated emotional labor for men. And also I think statistically, if you look at it, like everybody's lonely, but people keep framing it as like a male loneliness epidemic. It's like, no, we're all like disconnected from each other. So yeah, another reason that, documentation is so important is one of the things I look at in the book is framing. So how do we tell stories? What facts do we leave in and what facts do we leave out? And, in a news article, who do you think is worth quoting and how do you frame that headline? And again, the whole question what you're told because everybody brings biases, whether deliberate or not, and that's gonna shape how they're telling a story.
Well, thank you so much, Allison, for joining us and for spending so much time. It's been great.
If other
And
people are clapping, I think they're muted.
well, they can unmute. They can unmute and clap. Um, Wanted to make sure that I had your information in chat. I put down your website for infinitewoman.com, infinite-women.com. But you also mentioned you had a podcast. Is that is all and a
It's on the
newsletter?
website.
Is all of that on that website?
Yes, I've got a weekly newsletter that you can sign up for on the website. Every episode of the podcast is on there. I've been doing it since 2023. I've also got transcripts for every episode that are readily available, if that's more your jam. I've got playlists. So if you're particularly interested in women in sports or queer women or whatever floats your boat, there's a good chance I have a playlist that will appeal. Um, and yeah, there's also more information about the book on there, if anybody wants to have a look.
Great. And I know you're about ready to publish three more, or you're trying to get those three. We'll go on about that later, but I know that you've got more books in the works, so I look forward to seeing those.
I've always got things in the works, and what I've kind of discovered with the books, this I think needed to be a book, but other things, I'm kind of like, actually, should I just put this on my website? But yeah, there's so many ways to get stories out there, and yeah, I think that's something that everybody should keep in mind, that we all have platforms, whatever, however large or small they may be. So
Right, right. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight.
My pleasure.
And I'll hope to be in touch with you again soon.
yep, and if anybody wants to get in touch with me, Amy's got my info.
I do, and I can put it in our newsletter announcement following this meeting and everything with the recording. So for everybody who hasn't met Ken Norton, he has been our webmaster for approximately 8 years. And we recently switched over to a new platform, which meant that we weren't needing a manager. And so Ken has been fabulous over the last 8 years. He's easy to work with. He was someone that I could always go to and say, help, why, how do I post this? I wasn't able to do it myself because of the complexity of the old website. And Ken was so full of grace and so kind, and it was really easy to work with him. I know Rebecca and Elaine and I all got to work with him Rebecca and Elaine were working with him long before I was, and Eileen, I think, who's off the call now. But all of us benefited from Ken's work. And I had hoped to have a much larger group, but to be able to give him an applause, and I will have a letter that I'm sending to you, Ken, on our stationery so that you'll know it's official, about how wonderful you are and how much you've meant to this organization. And not just for our website, but for all the things you've done behind the scenes. And you're very supportive of the chapter. And so I wanted to say a personal thank you and to have you recognized. This is being recorded. So it'll go on our YouTube channel and everybody will know who you are. So thank you. Thank you very
You're
much.
so welcome. I it was an honor to work with Now.
Well, we're glad you did, and we hope you'll still stick around. And I'm glad you came tonight, you and Elaine.